welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the public. This particular program will deal with something historical in nature, but it will encourage us not only to look back at the past, but to look forward to the future to prevent the recurrence of some horrible incidents which took place in our country 60 years ago. This is the 60th anniversary month of the murder of three persons during the strike by the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, which was called in support of the People's Progressive Party, called for a hurricane of protest. And the Gawu strike officially started in March 1964, 60 years ago, although there was some unrest prior to the actual official date that the strike started. And when the strike did start on the 3rd of March, the first news we got was that a bomb had been thrown into a lorry carrying sugar workers who did not obey the strike for Gawu, by Gawu, and they were killed. The first one was Edgar Munro, an African Guyanese from Manchester Village in Region 6. The second one to die was an Indian Guyanese called Ramraj Gunraj, also from Manchester Village in Region 6. And both of them died in the same accident in the lorry they were traveling, was bombed by, presumably by Gawu terrorists at Tain Public Road. And there's a famous song by Nesbitt Changur about, it's called the Guyanese Lament. It's about the death of Monroe and Gunraj. And later the same month, a schoolboy, a 13-year-old schoolboy called, his name was Godfrey Teixeira, who was Portuguese. And he was killed by another bomb which was thrown into the school bus. Some people seem to choose school buses as their targets. Of course, about 14 children were injured, but Godfrey Teixeira died. So in the month of March 1964, the Gawu strike started off its bloody record by killing an African Guyanese, Monroe, an Indian Guyanese, Gunraj, and a Portuguese Guyanese, Teixeira. All that happened in the month of March, and it's a terrible way to start any strike. And we saw in March, the fusion of terrorism with unionism. It's the first time it has happened in Guyana. Everyone knew the role that unions played in Guyana's independence and Guyana's struggle against colonialism. And the fact is that in 1964, unionism, the noble tradition of unionism, got fused onto the bloody tradition of terrorism. So, my friends, in March 1964, we had these three murders, and there is no commemoration for these March murders. The people who committed the crime don't admit that it was their doing, and tragically, more murders were to follow. In fact, worse massacres were to follow. Well, the violence of the Gawu strike of 1964 is still remembered, and I don't think we need to pretend about it. We will not forget. The damage it has done is almost permanent. And those of us who are, inclined to support the doctrine and the practice of social cohesion must continue to work to make Guyana a safe place and a better place for all. So between March 1964 and July of the same year, there was widespread murder and arson and damage and destruction in this country. And more specifically, as we're speaking today, it seriously damaged any notion of working class solidarity, because what we had here were terrorists killing workers, people who did not go on strike. It is something unimaginable. Working class solidarity was smashed. in 1964. And the whole ideal of trade unionism, um, was overshadowed by the fall of terrorism. And I think some trade unions still use that expression in referring to one another, brother and sister. But all these notions were burnt by the corpses which were piled high in 1964 of so-called brothers or workers. We've already discussed in previous programs the whole idea behind the disturbances, and we don't need to go over the ground again. But we know that the PPP was able to deploy a regiment of terrorists, people who were given weapons from communist countries, people who received cash from communist countries, people who were trained in communist countries. So they were quite prepared for what was to take place in British Guiana in 1964. All this happened before the hurricane of protests. So it wasn't an accidental event. It was a carefully planned campaign. And what we saw, or what we know now, on reflection about the People's Progressive Party between 1954 and 1964, is that it was prepared to sacrifice human safety. It was prepared to sacrifice public security in order to seize total control of the country by any means necessary. By any means necessary. And in so doing, it fused terrorism onto unionism. And we know this because one of the persons who studied the leadership of the PPP carefully, who's written about the PPP behavior in 1964. And he is an eminent professor of Guyanese history. And his words were, his name is Professor Clem Sicharan. And his words were, which I mentioned on a previous program, the PPP was prepared to achieve its political objectives, which had more to do by employing sugar workers, that is, in violence, to achieve its political objective, which had more to do with the control of the state than it had to do with the conditions of work. So we know the Gawu strike, the 165-day strike of 1964, had little to do with working conditions. It had to do with the PPP's intention to seize total control of the state. And that is, in fact, the essence of the disturbances of 1964. What the PPP was trying to do, therefore, was to create widespread disruption in the colony of British Guiana so that the British would be forced to postpone elections, which were scheduled for the 7th of December 1964, and push it over to another year. The PPP had the strange hope that it could stay in power and not have to subject itself to elections on the proportional representation system. They wanted to retain the first past the post system, in which they continued 1957, 1961, 1964, continued to get minorities, but because of the gerrymandering of the constituency boundaries, they were able to get majority of seats in what was then called the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council, what we now know as the National Assembly. So the declared objective of the hurricane of protests was to give, these are not my words, these are the words coming from the PPP leadership, to give PPP supporters the opportunity, and I quote, to demonstrate their confidence in the leaders of the party in the face of the British government's betrayal at the London conference. The London conference, of course, had occurred in October, taking place in October 1963, when the leaders of the major political parties had gone up to London to discuss the future of what was then British Guyana. And as you know from your history, the leaders agreed that since they couldn't agree among themselves, the British government would impose a solution. And the solution the British government imposed was that there should be fresh elections before independence, and that the system of proportional representation would replace the system of first past the post. And as you know, up to now, um, 60 years later, Guyana still uses the proportional representation system. But when it was introduced in 1964, a lot of people died in order to attempt to prevent it from being introduced. So the way the PPP went about this campaign um, ended up in violent incidents mostly between January and July. Of course, there were incidents after that. But by July, about 176 persons had been killed. I think this is the most bloody strike in the history of the Anglophone Caribbean. Certainly it is in the history of Guyana. 176 people being killed during a trade union strike. That is by the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union. Most of the victims of violence were poor people, poor workers. So you had this bizarre situation in which working people who were terrorists were killing working people who just wanted to provide for their families. And that is in part what happened in 1964. Why did it happen? Why did Guyanese turn on each other during this Gawu strike? Um, we know that Gawu was um, demanding recognition by what is then called the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. In those days, the sugar industry in its entirety was owned by foreigners, by British companies, mostly by the Booker Sugar Estates Limited. And the main organization through which the sugar planters operated was called the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. Remember, for those of you who are younger, it was only later in the 1970s that the industry was nationalized and the Guyana Sugar Corporation was established to take over everything that the Booker Sugar Estates had. But up to that time, the sugar industry was essentially owned by the British. And the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union was attempting to demand to be recognized by the Sugar Producers Association in place of the union, which was already recognized by the Sugar Producers Association. That is the Manpower Citizens Association. So the strike's main objective was to mobilize, the sugar workers like troops, stormtroopers, to reinforce the party's hurricane of protest, which essentially was a campaign of terrorism to prevent the constitutional changes ordered by the British government. So this is what happened. And when the strike started, it came at the end of several threats and wildcat stoppages, especially at Leonora in what is now Region 3. But when the murders started, the murders went from Leonora to first to Region 6, because Region 6 now, as you know, is one of the main centers of sugar production. And Albion, you've heard about Albion, as the two workers, Monroe and Gunrad, were traveling to work on the Albion estate when the lorry beat Tain. If you know the geography of the country, when they reached Tain, a bomb which had been placed, not thrown, placed in the truck, in the lorry by another sugar worker, exploded, killing Monroe immediately, and Gunraj died later the same day. And of course, in these murders, literally from day one, the 4th of March, because the strike was called on the 3rd, and by day clean the next day, the killing started. But it was poor villagers, poor workers, not British colonial officials, The governor wasn't threatened. The planters weren't threatened. It was the poor workers who were the first to die. So those were the first two murders, workers killing workers. And then later on in March, we had a bomb being thrown in a school bus, because many of the estate officials had their children attending primary schools, and secondary schools in Georgetown. So the bus would take them. So the school bus idea um, had a long period of preparation before it was reintroduced. But the bomb was thrown into the bus, and 14 school children, mostly primary school children, were injured, and um, one died. That is Godfrey Teixeira. So that was symbolic of the murders in 1964. One African, one Indian, and one Portuguese. You must listen to that song again by Nesbitt Changor, and you'll see how bitter his lament was about what was happening in Guyana. So the disturbances started in Region 3, migrated to Region 6, and then back to Region 4. Those where the murders occurred. My friends, the question of Gawu's violence. Again, I turn to that Guyanese historian, Professor Clem Sicharan. He described the strike as, and I quote his words verbatim, an orgy of arson, bombing, and personal attacks on people who refuse to strike. Well, this is what the well researched, the eminent professor of history said. An orgy of arson, bombing, and personal attacks on people who refuse to strike. And this went on for about 4 months in what was then British Guiana. That strike is without precedent in the annals of our country. It was without parallel. Even today, 60 years later, there was never such a bloodthirsty strike as the Gawu called in 1964. So these were unresisting workers. These are workers who had picked up their machetes and their lunch and were traveling to work. These were school children coming back, from school at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Unresisting. This wasn't a battle in some, it wasn't a showdown between competing factions. These are people who are simply going to work and they're killed. Now, the murders had nothing to do with improving conditions of work in the sugar industry. This was meant to show the British that the PPP had the ability and had the interest in making Guyana ungovernable. And as a result of what was happening in 1964, and later on, as you know, that in previous programs we dealt with other massacres, such as the massacre of the Abraham family in June 1964. And as a result of that, many Portuguese families migrated. It was a very bitter period, but these people were pushed out of the country by the sheer violence of the PPP. The Portuguese community had a very strong footing in business in 1960s, but it was all destroyed by the PPP's campaign of terror and the indiscriminate killing of a large number of unresisting victims during the disturbances. I believe it would be a waste of time just narrating incident after incident that occurred in our past without trying to find a solution. And this program, the public interest, it's not intended to be a history lesson. It's intended to be an educational experience in which we Guyanese, our generation, people who might have witnessed the violence of the disturbances, could sit down with present generations and discuss what happened in order to prevent a recurrence. It's an educational program. And you may not agree with the analyses, but it may encourage you, viewers and listeners, particularly mothers, particularly women, who have responsibility for their children, to think about the future of their children and think about the type of society we're living in. And I would say that 1964 was a case study in violence. And it would help us to understand what happened It would help us to explain causation of these murders and massacres. And most of all, it would encourage us to prevent a recurrence of such atrocities. Um, why do people kill, or why did people in British Guiana 60 years ago kill one another in such numbers? I will advance for, I can only call them notions because you can never prove that these are the real causes of the disturbances. Number one was anger. And when people are angry, they do stupid things, sometimes cruel things, malicious things. And there certainly was anger in the corridors of power of government and in the conferences of the PPP, because they felt, the members of the PPP at the time felt that the British government had betrayed. They used the word betrayed. But the truth is that all three leaders, Dr. Jagger, Mr. Burnham, and Mr. Degar, sat down and agreed. They signed on the dotted line that the British should adjudicate. The British should decide on the issues that were submitted to them, and the British did decide. And when the British decided, well, then the PPP demonstrated anger. And of course, by the time Dr. Jagger got back, I think the people in the PPP were waiting for him, and his life became very, very difficult. And this hurricane of protest was a means of venting their anger at the British government. But at the same time, it was the Guyanese people who suffered, not the British government. The British government had colonies in Asia and Africa, the Caribbean, and they hardly seemed to be bothered. After they'd made their decision, they just walked away. And the killings, the murders had to be borne by Guyanese mothers, Guyanese families. So the anger was the first cause of the violence in the disturbances. And the anger was, I said, was without parallel in Guyanese history. People can control their anger. People can go about, political relations without venting their anger in massacres and murders and bombings and arson. But this is not what happened. But in my view, the first cause was anger at the British government decision, and this is anger in the minds of the PPP decision makers. The second cause, I would say, was sheer contempt, contempt for the human rights of others, contempt for other citizens. This is not a matter of nicety. When people throw a bomb in a school bus, when people send, their members of the PYO to communist countries to train in sabotage, when weapons are imported, automatic weapons are imported from communist countries, and then these trained PYO cadres, armed and financed and motivated, are sent out to kill. Those machine guns are not meant for hunting deer and going up the creek and shooting fish. The weapons were designed and intended to kill, and that is exactly what happened, because it was clear that the PPP had no concern for human life. So at first, I would think people used to think it was something purely racial, but certainly it turned out that they had no contempt for the life of anybody who opposed them. So that is why the March murders are significant. What would they say now if the first boy to be killed was named Teixeira, a Portuguese? The first, workers to be killed were an African, Edgar Monroe, and Ramraj Gunraj, an Indian, on the current team. So it was apparently indiscriminate. And it seemed that they were prepared to kill anybody who they felt opposed their way of seeing things. And it is a phenomenon. It is a condition we've seen throughout the last 60 years, in which the PPP have very deep contempt for the human rights of other citizens. And you can see it taking place in Guyana today, that the willingness to sit down and consult and communicate and cooperate and collaborate is not there. What you see is contempt. The third factor, I think, was the PPP has an ideology which is premised on control of the state. It's not premised on sharing, on cooperatives and socialism and all that. It's based on control. Many people feel that the PPP was a communist organization. Not communist at all. It is a Leninist organization which believes in state control. Leninism doesn't have anything to do with communism. It has to do with control of the state. That is, a party, establishes itself as the government, and it prevents other parties from functioning properly. And whatever that party dictates or determines is the way it will be. And it is not a question of, for example, as we have in Guyana nowadays, calling in the unions to sit down and discuss. No. Things don't happen like that. In the Soviet way of thinking, in the Leninist way of thinking. It's a question of control. It is felt that the people who seize control have been put there with a historical mission to dominate every section of society. The trade unions, the civil society, and you can see what happens in Guyana now. There's no regard for the civil society. There's no regard for trade unionism. There's no regard for the rights of others. One party rules, and that is the way the PPP was trained to think intellectually. It wasn't trained to share. It was trained to control, trained to dominate. And the fourth factor I'd mentioned, I think we can all go along. I think examining what happened in 1964, but only in terms of thinking about the future. I think the fourth factor is the question of revenge. And you must know that in 1962 there were riots. There was public disorder, particularly in Georgetown, because the PPP introduced a budget which was harmful to workers, particularly public servants. And there was some disorder, and parts of the city of Georgetown were burned down. It's not racial disorder. It was a protest against the provisions of the budget. And the PPP felt, well, it was anti-government. It was anti-government because the government introduced the budget. And in 1963, the following year, the PPP tried to introduce a labor relations bill, which would have forced corporations, particularly the sugar companies, to hold polls to determine which union, or in fact, throughout the country, it would force polls to determine which unions got the support of the workers. But this was similar to the bill that was introduced in 1953, 10 years before. So many people were surprised that when the British threw them out of power in 1953 for introducing a similar bill, they brought it back in 1963. And you must bear in mind that the president of the TUC, and in fact the BGTUC at that time, was not controlled by the PNC party. The president was aligned to the people of the United Force. His name was Richard Ishmael, and he was supportive of the United Force. So the PNC didn't have a say. It was Ishmael, after whom a certain high school is named, who was the president of the TUC. And it was a TUC strike in 1963. But because of the disorder in 1962, and the disorder in 1963, the PPP blamed the opposition. So it was revenge. It was a carefully cold-blooded, calculated campaign of revenge for what it felt it endured in 1962 and 1963. That is my analysis. You may choose to make your own analysis. But what I see is that 1964 was symptomatic, it was symbolic of the fusion of the trade union ideal, unionism, with terrorism. Many people in the 1960s would remember singing along the song Solidarity Forever, but it was shattered in 1964 when the PPP's hurricane of protests and the Gawu's strike in the sugar industry. It was the earliest and the most gruesome example of widespread public disorder, brought terrorism and unionism together. The Gawu strike exemplified what Clem Ciceran wrote, and forgive me for quoting Ciceran 3 times in this program. Professor Clem Ciceran, and you must read what he had to say. He explained how workers could be encouraged to commit violent acts, and I quote, to achieve political objectives which had more to do with the control of the state than with their conditions of work. He lamented that workers could have been manipulated and encouraged to control or to commit violent acts in order to achieve political objectives which had more to do with the control of the state than with their conditions of the work. My friends, the disturbances have left a lingering legacy of distrust, and it has exposed for all time the PPP's frightening propensity for state violence. We've all suffered, and as Guyanese, make sure that there's no recurrence of that type of state violence by the People's Progressive Party administration. Thank you, and may God bless you.
In public road the beginning, where in the lorry they come. Out of the darkness is pelted, out of blackness comes the bomb. Negro and Indian screaming, onto the roadway they fall. Is this the only way races will join today? Join in barbarous death, gun, Raj and Monroe. All end in agony. When will our hatreds end, and race with race work together as friends? Anywhere hatred is sown, violence will grow and be spread. First Alice crushed in the roadway, and Gardner cut down and dead. Now meaningless death all around us, from Buxton to Wismar men die. So many lives we see wasted in tragedy. See how our hatred destroys Guyana.